Hello, and welcome to this webinar on the obligations related to exports of hazardous chemicals outside the EU. My name is Salla Günther, and I'm presenting this webinar today with my PIC team colleagues Valeria Yilmaz and Ramona Choata. Today, you can expect from us to learn the key elements of the PIC regulation and the Rotterdam Convention. You will also be informed about the two main procedures related to PIC: the export notification and explicit consent requirements. You will also learn practical tips on how to prepare and submit your notifications and Article 10 reports in the ePIC submission tool. And very importantly, you can also use this opportunity to ask questions from us. To ask questions, please join the Q&A panel at slido.com using the event code PIC 2020. You can ask questions from our panelists from the PIC team until 3 o'clock Helsinki time, and we will aim at answering as many questions as possible. We do, however, ask you to limit your questions to the material presented today. If you have any questions after the event, you can of course contact us using the help desk contact forms provided in the link on your screen. The material presented today will be, of course, published. The video recording, the presentations, and the Q&A transcript will be made available on the ECA Webinars website. The agenda today will include a general overview and the scope of the PIC regulation. We will then have a closer look at the export notification and related procedures. We will also give you a practical presentation on how to fill in an export notification. And finally, we will have a short presentation on the annual reporting obligations before concluding with some take-home messages. So we start with a general overview and the scope of the PIC regulation. In the very high level, the PIC regulation is about the trade of hazardous chemicals. It places obligations mainly on EU-based exporters who intend to export hazardous chemicals from the EU to non-EU countries. The PIC regulation also provides support to the developing countries through the information exchange of hazardous chemicals. The Rotterdam Convention is a United Nations treaty concerning the trade of hazardous chemicals in the global level. The key principle of the convention is to request a prior informed consent from the importing party before the export can take place. It also assists mainly developing countries to manage risks that the use of hazardous chemicals could pose to human health and the environment. In the EU, the Rotterdam Convention is implemented by the so-called PIC Regulation. The aim of the PIC Regulation and the Rotterdam Convention is to promote shared responsibility and cooperation in the international movement of hazardous chemicals. These objectives are embedded in the key procedures: the export notification requirement, including the request for an acknowledgement of receipt, and the PIC procedure. The PIC regulation also aims at protecting human health and the environment by providing all importing countries with information on characteristics of hazardous chemicals and on how to store, transport, use, and dispose of such chemicals safely. Now, what are then the differences between PIC and the Convention? The PIC regulation goes beyond the provisions of the Rotterdam Convention in order to achieve a higher level of protection of human health and the environment. Namely, the EU notifies the exports to all countries and not only to the parties who have ratified the Convention. Also, the number of chemicals covered by the PIC regulation is larger. The structure of the PIC regulation is different in that it further divides the use categories under the convention into 4 subcategories, which also implies that more chemicals are listed. While the Annex 3 of the convention lists 52 chemicals, the Annex 1 of the PIC regulation covers currently a total of 228 entries. The EU also requires an export notification irrespective of the intended use in the country of destination, and not only for the use in which the chemical is either banned or severely restricted. This is because it cannot be guaranteed that the declared use in the notification will correspond to the use in the importing country. The PIC regulation applies to chemicals that are either banned or severely restricted in the EU for health or environmental reasons. Those chemicals are regulated as active substances in plant protection products, biocidal products, including disinfectants, insecticides, and parasiticides. The industrial chemicals are regulated under REACH. The PIC regulation also lists chemicals which are banned for exports from the EU. Those are the POPs, persistent organic pollutants, and entries reflecting the mercury regulation. In addition, it should be noted that all chemicals, also those not listed by PIC, must comply with the CLP regulation when exported from the EU. The chemicals subject to PIC are listed in Annex 1 and 5 to the regulation. Annex 1 is further divided into 3 parts. Part 1 consists of chemicals which have been banned or severely restricted within the EU in at least one of the 4 subcategories defined by the regulation. Industrial chemicals are divided into chemicals for use by professionals and for use by the general public. Pesticides are divided into pesticides as plant protection products and biocides. In case the chemical is listed in Part 1, there may be important uses which still remain authorized in the EU. Part 2 consists of chemicals which have been banned or severely restricted within the EU in one of the categories defined by the Convention. All or virtually all uses in the whole category are prohibited in the EU. Part 3 corresponds to Annex 3 of the Convention, and these chemicals are also subject to the PIC procedure under the Convention. Annex 5, in turn, is divided into 2 parts. Part 1 lists the POPs under the Stockholm Convention, and Part 2 reflects the regulation on mercury. As already mentioned previously, the exports of Annex 5 chemicals are banned, with some exceptional conditions in Part 2. The annexes are usually updated once a year by the Commission, following developments in EU legislation and internationally under the Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions. The most recent amendment, covering 22 new entries, was published on 21st of July this year, and it entered into application on 1st of September. When exporting PIC chemicals outside the EU, the obligations apply to pure substances listed in Annex 1, either as an individual entry or as an entry within a group substance. The obligation also apply when exporting mixtures containing one or more chemicals listed in Annex 1, in condition that the concentration of the PIC substance in the mixture triggers labeling under CLP. Articles are also in scope in case they contain one or more Part 2 or 3 chemicals of Annex 1, And the use of the PIC chemical has been banned or severely restricted in the EU in that particular product. What does PIC then not apply to? Chemicals found in drugs, radioactive materials, wastes, chemical weapons, food and food additives, feeding stuffs, and medicinal products are regulated by other EU legislation and therefore do not fall under the remit of the regulation. Also, chemicals for research or analysis purposes are not in scope when exported in quantities that are unlikely to affect human health or the environment, and that in any event do not exceed 10 kilograms from each exporter to each importing country per calendar year. In such cases, however, exporters should obtain a reference identification number by means of a special RIN request procedure. Based on the approaches agreed in the meetings of the designated national authorities, two specific cases concerning the scope and the implementation should be noted. Firstly, a UVCB containing a big substance as constituent are not subject to notification requirement. However, in case the UVCB itself is listed in Annex 1, it of course falls under the scope of PIC. Secondly, PIC substances as impurities of other substances should not be notified. These agreements are not to be considered as definitive as the discussions are still ongoing and the approaches may change in the future. What are then the specific conditions for exporting PIC chemicals? There are two types of requirements stemming from the regulation. The export notification requirement as defined in Article 8. The data requirements for export notifications are specified in Annex 2. And the explicit consent requirement in accordance with the provisions of Article 14. The specific steps and the workflows will be explained in the following presentation, so now we look at the procedures in connection with Annex 1. All chemicals listed in Annex 1 are subject to export notification procedure. Chemicals which are listed in Part 2, in addition to the export notification, are also subject to explicit consent requirement. This means that the export cannot take place unless the importing country provides its consent. The conditions for Part 3 depends on the use category of the export and the existence of an import response in the latest PIC circular. The PIC circular is published twice a year by the Convention Secretariat. In more concretely, if the use category of the Part 3 substance matches with the PIC use category and there is a positive import response available, the export can take place. This export should, however, be notified by means of a special RIN request. If the use categories match, but there is a negative import response published, the exports are not allowed. If the intended export is for a different use category, or in case there is no response available at all, the conditions for the export require both an export notification and an explicit consent from the importing party. And to conclude this presentation, we will still have a look at the different obligations. But before explaining the specific obligations for companies, it is important to understand that there are several actors in the EU with different roles. The European Commission, DG Environment more specifically, is the common designated national authority of the whole Union. Each member state has an appointed designated national authority, DNA, to carry out the administrative functions and to be the first contact point for companies. ECHA carries out administrative functions and also provides technical and scientific assistance to all stakeholders. Each member state has also the obligation to designate authorities, such as customs, for controlling the exports and imports. The Commission, member states, and ECHA work in close collaboration and meet formally twice a year. For companies, there are obligations before, during, and after the export. When planning an export, companies should first of all determine if the chemical is covered by PIC and if it can be exported or not. The consolidated list of PIC chemicals is available on ECHA's website. It is, however, important to understand that the group substances are not considered fully comprehensive as they can be populated further over time. If the substance is covered by PIC, then the adequate procedure should be applied. It should be verified whether the export falls under the full notification procedure or can it be notified via the special RIN request. If there are any doubts about the chemicals or the procedures, please contact either your DNA or ECHA. The notification must always be submitted within the EPIC submission tool. No submissions or supporting documents are valid if they are provided outside the system. At the time of the export, the companies must ensure the compliance with Article 17. Article 17 concerns exports of all chemicals and is not limited to big chemicals only. When exported, the chemicals has to be packaged and labeled as if they were to be placed on the EU market, unless there are specific provisions in the importing country. A safety data sheet, in accordance with REACH, has to be provided to all importers in the country of destination. The safety data sheet should be given as far as practicable in one of the official or principal languages of the importing country. And finally, the actual quantities exported must be reported in accordance with Article 10 by 31st of March in the following year of the export. The Article 10 report must also be done within the EPIC submission system. Further details about the Article 10 will be then given in the last presentation of this webinar. And similarly, the EU importers must also provide the actual quantities of PIC chemicals that they imported into EU during the previous calendar year in accordance with Article 10. But the importers have no other obligations under the PIC regulation as the imports are regulated by means of other EU legislation, mainly by REACH regulation. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, my name is Valeria Yilmaz and I work in the PIC team at ECHA. I would like to continue this webinar with the export notification and the related procedures. First, I would like to say a few words about the export notification procedure. The first export in each subsequent year and for each importing country should be notified. The export notification should be submitted 35 days before the first export is due to take place. A reference identification number, or shortly RIN, is assigned for each notification. So what is a RIN, or a reference identification number? It is a unique identifier of an export notification required for customs declaration. It is comprised of 10 numbers and letters, starting with an 1 for a standard notification and a 0 for a special RIN. I will talk more about special RINs later in my presentation. The RIN status changes over time, and it indicates if export is allowed and sometimes when it is allowed. There are 5 possible statuses of RIN. So the first one is active with the validity indicated in the brackets. So it means that the export is allowed. It can take place within the given time period. The next status is inactive with the validity given in the brackets. And it means that the export is not allowed. It cannot take place yet, but it will be allowed within the given time period. The next RIN status is inactive, and it means that the export has not been allowed yet, and it's linked to the explicit consent request pending, which I will talk about a bit later in my presentation. The next RIN status is disabled, and it means that the export is not allowed. Finally, the final possible RIN status is expired, and it means that the RIN refers to a past year, and it cannot be used as a basis for exports anymore. The export notification workflow is as follows. The exporter prepares and submits an export notification, and it follows up both the export notification and the RIN status throughout their lifecycle. The designated national authority, or shortly DNA, checks the export notification and asks for resubmission if needed. ECHA validates the export notification if it is compliant or asks for resubmission if needed. Also, ECHA verifies if it is the first yearly export notification and forwards it to the DNA of the importing country if it is needed. There are 2 possible deviations to the standard procedure. It's the emergency situation or the special RIN request. The emergency situation refers to a public health or environmental emergency where delay can worsen the situation in the destination country. In this case, there is no requirement to submit 35 days prior to the export. In this case, also the export notification is not subject to the explicit consent procedure, and it requires an approval by the European Commission. The emergency export notification workflow is very similar to the standard workflow. But as you can see from the slide, in addition, there comes the approval by the Commission at the end. The other possible deviation to the standard procedure is the special RIN request. What is a special RIN request? It is a so-called light procedure for exports of PIC chemicals, exempted from the PIC obligation, from the PIC regulation, but which require a code for customs clearance. The special RIN requests are checked by the exporter's DNA, and ECHA is not involved in the process. There are 3 possible scenarios when a special RIN request can be made. The first case is for Annex 1 and 5 chemicals in quantities less than 10 kilograms per year and per importing country for research and analysis purposes. In this case, a special RIN request should be obtained for customs clearance. The second scenario is when an importing country waived its right to receive an export notification. And finally, when a positive import response is available on Rotterdam Convention website, Rotterdam Convention parties. So special RIN requests can be submitted in bulk. There are three possible cases when it can be done. The first one is when one chemical is exported to several countries. The second one is when several chemicals are exported to one country. And finally, when several chemicals are exported to several countries. It's important to note here that in this case, RINs are assigned per importing country. So this is it about the export notification. And now I would like to talk about the explicit consent procedure. The explicit consent is required for Annex 1, Part 2 and 3 chemicals. It is sought and received by the exporter's designated national authority from the importer's designated national authority. Explicit consent can have different restrictions. For example, it can be limited in validity, it can be importer-specific, use-specific, and so on. Here it's important to note that companies are not involved in the process. The explicit consent procedure is as follows. It is triggered by the exporter submitting the export notification for Part 2 or 3 chemical. And then the EU DNA sends the request to the importing country. The importing country's DNA, as a response, sends an explicit consent or a negative reply. The EU DNA registers the consent or a negative reply in EPIC. And ECHA activates the RINs, applicable RINs, based on the response. The workflow of the export notification when an explicit consent is required is as follows. The exporter prepares and submits an export notification. The designated national authority checks an export notification and asks for a submission if needed. These steps are follow the standard procedure. However, next, the DNA proposes RIN activation based on existing consent or requests a new consent from the importing country. Then ECHA verifies the applicability of the consent and validates the export notification if it is compliant and if the consent is applicable. The rest of the steps are as in the standard procedure. The requirement for a positive valid consent from the importing country can be waived on a case-by-case basis in two different cases. If the importing country is a member of the OECD, this applies only to Part 2 chemicals. And if no response is received from the importing country 60 days after request was made by the EU DNA. And this applies to both Part 2 and 3 chemicals. Depending on the type of the waiver, the waiver can be proposed at different time in the process. For OECD waivers, they can be proposed right after the submission of the export notification for Part 2 chemicals. For a standard waiver, the proposal can be made if no response is received from the importing country within 60 days after the request was made. What exactly is a waiver? A waiver is a documentary evidence that the substance is licensed, registered, or authorized in the importing country. A waiver is submitted in the EPIC application. The approval is done by the EU DNA in consultation with the European Commission on a case-by-case basis. ECHA is not involved in this process, and waivers can be granted a validity for a maximum period of 12 months. For more information on waivers, please see the waiver information sheet available on the ECHA website. Thank you for your attention.
Hello everyone, I am Ramona Cioată and I work here at ECHA in the PIC team. I will continue the presentation of this webinar by giving you a few practical guidelines on how to fill in an export notification and then few recommendations for when preparing the Article 10 annual report in EPIC. Within the next slides, I will be showing you how to fill in an export notification using the template available in the PIC tool, how to submit the export notification, and also give you some examples in order to avoid the resubmission requests or rejections of the export notifications. Few relevant information before you start filling in the export notification. We remind you that according to the PIC regulation, only one export notification is needed for the same PIC chemical, for the same year, and for the same importing country. Also, please select the appropriate template depending on what is it that you intend to export, a pure substance or a mixture. Remember that if you export a mixture, have in mind to select the template from the left menu and create the master data beforehand. Let's get now into the template for creating an export notification for a substance. You will notice that there are sections to fill in, also a section for attachments. In section 1, you need to select the importing country from the drop-down list, and should there be any important information available about the importing country selected, then this is visible in the link that appears now on your screenshot in red. Also in section 1, information on the chemical identity has to be provided. If the PIC chemical intended to be exported is a single substance, you can select it from the drop-down list. If the substance is for a group substance, then we advise you to insert manually the CAS number. Once these are provided, the rest of identifiers available for ECHA will be automatically filled in. The CN code field is editable. Since ECHA cannot guarantee the pre-filled code is up to date, please check and correct if needed. Section 2 of the export notification is shown instead of Section 1 when you intend to export a mixture. And since the master data is added before starting to fill in the export notification template, here you only have to select the correct mixture or article from the drop-down list. Section 3 of the export notification template is referring to information about the export, such as the export intended date, which is set according to PIC regulation to be possible only after 35 days from the date you will be submitting the export notification. There is an exemption from the obligation to notify with 35 days before, as my colleague Valeria explained it in her presentation. Therefore, if you tick this box, a free text field will appear, and here you need to provide the justification describing the emergency situation. Also in section 3, you have to include the quantity of the chemical to be exported, and this refers to an estimation for the whole year, and here you also need to select the unit measure from the drop-down list. The actual quantities exported will be later on submitted through the Article 10 report. Going further in Section 3, you need to include information on the foreseen use in the importing country. Here you select the known use category, and depending on which one you select, industrial chemical or pesticides, you will need to provide information on the intended use. This field is important for the importing country, and moreover, when a consent response is required, information included here will help the importing country's authorities to decide faster on the type of response. Section 3 also includes information in the importing companies. Therefore, depending on the importing country selected in Section 1, a list of importers will be available if you have previously introduced them, or if the list is empty, you can here add them by accessing the Manage Importers tab. It is important to note here that according to PIC regulation, a physical address needs to be provided, and therefore only giving a PO box as address is not acceptable. Many non-EU authorities regularly verify and notify the exports with the importing companies, and we notice that they provide more restrictive explicit consents or even negative consents due to the fact that they could not physically locate the importing companies. Next are Section 4 and 5 in the template, and these contain information on the hazards and risks of the chemical to be exported. Most of this information are included in the safety data sheet, and these next fields are mandatory to be filled in only if you didn't tick the box that you will attach an SDS. As mentioned before, for mixtures, the safety data sheet is added when creating the master data beforehand. And also the information in field 4.1 will come from the master data pre-filled by you in the master data. Please provide a safety data sheet in the official language of the importing country or in one of its principal languages. The field 5.2 is also pre-filled with the word safety data sheet if you tick the box that you will attach an SDS. Section 6 of the export notification is dedicated to information related to regulatory status and actions taken at the European Union level on the chemical you intend to export. In this section, the importing countries will see the status on how the chemical they are about to import is regulated in the European Union. Section 6.1 is pre-filled by EPIC with a summary of the regulatory actions in EU and is considering the language preferences of the importing country. Once you have selected the substance in 6.1, in section 1, then the text will be pre-filled in section 6.1. If you would like to complement this information, then you have to make sure that the information is most recent and verifiable against EU regulations. The checkboxes in subsection 6.2 are also pre-filled according to the regulatory restrictions in EU and cannot be edited. The next three text fields below the checkboxes have to be filled in with examples of known uses that are prohibited or allowed in the EU. Please note that is enough if you fill in only one of these two fields. We would like to stress here that examples given have to be referring to uses of at the EU level and to refer to the PIC chemical to be exported and not to the mixture or the product that you are exporting. In order to help more in this section, ECA developed an in-brief document on how to fill in this information. And the link is available here on this slide, and it will be also shown at the end of this presentation. Also very important on the uses that will be given in section 6.2, section that refers to uses regulated in EU. They should not be confused with uses to be given in section 3, section that refers to uses intended in the country of destination. So while in 6.2 we have a use that is verifiable immediately in this example shown on your screens now with the text that was pre-filled according to regulatory status in EU, for section 3 the information will refer to what is known that the chemical will be used for in the country of destination, in this case a disinfectant at the destination. Further in section 6, we have few free text fields that refer to quantities. This, as entire section 6, refer to information known at EU level. Thus, here the information has to be about yearly estimated quantities at EU level of the chemical to be exported. These fields are not mandatory to be filled in, so please leave them empty if information is not known to you. Subsection 6.3, information should refer to any known regulatory document regarding the chemical to be exported. Document has to be official and enforced and must refer to regulatory actions at EU level. This field is also not mandatory. Last section in the export notification contains attachments relevant to the notified export. Here you attach the SDS. In case for some reason the attaching functionality did not work properly, this section will be signaled as visible here, and you will not be able to move forward to submit your notification. As also mentioned earlier, TSDS for mixtures will be instead attached in the mixture master data prepared beforehand. At any moment you want to save the data already filled in the template and continue later, you will notice that a RIN will be assigned by EPIC. However, the notification will remain in draft status until you will move forward to submit it. In case there will be any incomplete or incorrect information in one of the sections, when clicking on either Save or Submit button, the section containing the error will be highlighted as in the screenshot here. And by accessing that section, you will see an error message that will explain you what to do in order to correct it. Once all the information is in, you will be able to move forward to submitting the export notification. You will have to click on the Submit button. And after this, the information will be visible to you for one last check, and potentially there will be some declaration boxes that you will need to tick depending on the substance and or the language of the safety data sheet attached. You will have a message telling you that in order to go forward for the submission of the notification, you need to click on the Submit Notification to DNA. Next, make sure that you get to the confirmation page as shown in this screenshot. You will also have there a message that export notification has been submitted successfully. Well done then. Your notification is submitted and will go further in the process. What's next, you will ask? You will want to follow up on the progress of your export notification, and there are a couple of ways to follow up. First and easiest is by following the automated email alerts received from EPIC to the email address that you have provided. You will receive alerts when status of your export notification changes, such as when it's validated, when it's activated, or if resubmission is requested, or if your export notification has been rejected. In case of resubmission request or rejection, the email alert will contain a link to the message referring to the reason for which it was requested the resubmission or the reason that your export notification has been rejected. As you can see in the screenshot, message is easily accessible from the email alert that you receive. You can also check the status of a specific RIN from the Search and View option on the left menu, but also you can check the status of your inactive RINs. So you just need to click on the tile that shows the inactive RINs, and then they will be shown to you as in the list here, and you can easily see their statuses. And you can also see if you have any unread messages for them. As mentioned, you can check also by using the left side menu, Search and View. You have an option there. You can insert a certain RIN that you're interested in. It will be shown to you, and if, like in this example here, the status is pending resubmission, you just need to click on it and you can start editing it immediately. It is also possible to check the history of actions performed on your export notification. You just need to open it, and when click on the View button on the upper right corner, you have the Event History option. And you will see the steps starting with the first one at the bottom. So, respectively, the date when you have submitted the notification, when it has been checked by your DNA, and in case of part 2 or 3 substances, when the consent has been requested from the importing country authorities. You can also check the messages. The same way you access your export notification, you go to the upper right corner, click on the View button, then the Message History option. The messages will be shown like in this screenshot, and if you click on the arrow, the message will be expanded. In the following slides, I will give you a few examples of cases where information provided is not in line with the requirements, and a resubmission would be requested. According to PIC regulation, a physical address of the importer is required. Therefore, whenever a notification is received and for the address we only have a PO box, like in this example here, this notification would need to be resubmitted so that instead a physical address to be provided, easily to be located by authorities in the importing country. Some importing countries have specific requests when it comes to the category of the intended use in their country for a certain type of chemical. That is why it is important to check the importing country info, which is available also when selecting the importing country in section 1. By clicking on the link visible there in red, the specific request from the importing country can be seen. In this example here, this importing country requires that biocidal products are to be categorized as industrial chemical. Therefore, if the export notification for a chemical with intended use as disinfectant, thus a biocidal use, has in section 3 selected pesticide, this will be sent back to be corrected so that instead to tick the box for industrial chemical. One other reason for resubmission request would be the mismatch between the concentration range of the notified chemical and the concentration in the SDS attached. As you can see in this example here, there is a mismatch in the concentration provided in the export notification compared with the one in the SDS attached. Therefore, this notification would go for resubmission so that instead the SDS attached will have the concentration range matching the one of the PIC chemical in the notification. As mentioned in the previous slides, information in subsection 6.2 on allowed and prohibited uses has to refer to the PIC chemical exported and not to the product in the composition of which the PIC chemical is exported. Therefore, if the allowed use in this section is mentioning uses of a spray or other product where the PIC chemical is the active ingredient, resubmission will be requested so that instead the uses would refer to the PIC chemical at the EU level. Information that is also verifiable on ECHA website on biocidal products. In this example here. On the same subsection, another reason to request a resubmission would be when the information provided as allowed or prohibited uses in EU for the PIC chemical cannot be verified against regulatory decisions in EU. In this example here, the information provided as prohibited use in EU in the green square is correct and verifiable immediately with also the legal text pre-filled in the subsection above. However, the text that comes after talks about some allowed uses that first should have not been included as prohibited uses in the field of prohibited uses. And secondly, it refers to information that cannot be verified against any regulatory decisions in EU for this PIC chemical. Moreover, the text seems to be similar with what has been provided as intended use in the importing country. Thus, a resubmission will be requested in this case to provide as uses verifiable information. It is important to mention here that if use is intended in the destination country, it does not necessarily mean that this is an allowed use in EU. Therefore, the uses allowed in EU, according to regulations in force, should not be confused with uses intended in the importing country. In the following, I will give you a couple of examples for when export notifications are to be rejected and new export notifications should be submitted instead. A mismatch between the importing country and the city where the importer is located is a reason for rejection. Thus, an export notification for an importer in Hong Kong has to be submitted as a new export notification so that as a country of destination, Hong Kong to be selected, which is available as a separate entry in EPIC. There can also happen that a notification is submitted for a pure substance, as in this example here. However, when opening the STS attached, we see that a mixture should have been submitted instead. Therefore, this would be rejected, so that instead the notification for a mixture template to be selected. One last example is the case of duplications of already notified chemicals. According to the PIC regulation, only one notification is needed per year for the same pure substance and the same importing country. Therefore, if, for example, you export during that year the same chemical already notified to a different importer this time, or initial estimated quantity maybe changes, you do not need to submit a new export notification. In these cases, a warning message will be visible to you. Therefore, please check if a new notification is really needed. The warning message does not prevent you from still submitting that notification. However, it will be most probably rejected. And with this last example, I end the practical part for how to fill in the export notification, and I will move forward to give you a few recommendations related to annual Article 10 report on exports and imports according to the obligations you have as an exporter or importer under PIC regulation. As my colleague Sala already mentioned your obligations under Article 10 report, I will now refer to the practical part only, therefore the part for preparing the Article 10 report where EPIC is providing you some support. On exports, EPIC provides the web form where you can build your report for the exports that took place in the previous year. For the exports that have been notified in EPIC, the data will be pre-filled, and this will include the export notifications validated, the special RIN requests according to Annex 1, Part 3, the special RINs request for countries that waive their right to receive export notification. What is exempted and will not show in the pre-filled list will be the special RIN request according to Article 2, Paragraph 3 of PIC Regulation. On imports, the format is the same. However, the data has to be included manually as it is not available beforehand in EPIC. Once you start preparing the data to be reported, we recommend that you perform the following checks. There might be in the list RINs for which, however, the export did not happen. Therefore, for these ones, you need to leave them in the list. They have to have instead zero quantity. Since only one export notification is needed per year according to the PIC regulation, subsequent exports during that year will need to be reported here. So if you exported to different importers using the same RINs, then you need to add them here with their names and addresses. Regarding the quantities reported, please note that these should be in kilograms as unit of measure. Therefore, please consider converting the quantities to fit the report requirements. While in the export notification, the intended quantity to be exported refers to the whole mixture, in the Article 10, please include the quantity of only the PIC chemical exported the previous year. If it happened during the previous year that you exported PIC chemicals that have not been notified, they will not be found in the list available in EPIC, and you have to insert them manually at the moment you prepare the report. In the case that you have exported PIC chemicals in the previous year, but you did not submit any export notifications, the report has to be generated and filled in manually using the EPIC functionality on the left side menu in EPIC. A quick note on the legal deadline to submit the Article 10 reports, as also mentioned by my colleague Salla. This is every year on the 31st of March for the data of the previous year. This year, the deadline has been extended until 31st of May in order to offer more time to the companies that have been affected by the pandemic restrictions. Every year, with almost 2 weeks before, EPIC sends an automatic reminder with letting you know that it's time to submit the report to your DNAs. After the deadline, you can no longer create or submit the report in EPIC. Only in case you have submitted already and your DNA sent it back to you for amendments, then you will be able to resubmit even if the deadline passed. In case you missed the deadline, you will also have an error message in EPIC when trying to edit or submit the report. And this message will inform you to contact your DNA for support. We are now reaching the end of this webinar, and we would like to conclude it with few take-home messages. If you're either an exporter or importer of PIC chemicals or both, start by getting familiar with your obligations on the PIC, as well as with the procedures depending on what are the PIC chemicals that you export or import, and also the requirements of the non-EU countries. When filling in the export notification, being it for pure substance, mixture, article, ensure that you provide accurate information in all the sections. To avoid this way resubmission requests that could delay the intended date of export. In particular, pay attention to Section 3, which is referring to intended use in the country of destination, and Section 6, which is referring to uses of the PIC chemical in EU. Accurate information will also ease the decision process of importing countries to consent the imports. If you are exporting chemicals that require consent from the importing countries, remember that this is a procedure dealt between the authorities, and importers or exporters' communications cannot be considered in the explicit consent process. Also, another important message would be to remember to follow up on the export notification submitted and check if any actions are needed from your side. Last but not least, there are many guidance documents available on ECHA website, so please check them at your own need and pace. Here are some of the materials that ECHA published as support for the exporters and also for the importers of PIC chemicals. They are easily accessible from the link visible now on your screens. You will have their EPIC user manual and also some fact sheets with practical information. Here is another useful link where you have information that would help you better understanding the PIC regulation. For example, you have also the link to the Rotterdam Convention page where you can find responses from importing countries on certain chemicals. This was the end of our presentation for today's webinar. We hope it has been useful for you. You will be able to ask the questions by joining the question and answer panel at slido.com and use the event code PIC 2020. However, we ask you to limit your questions to the material presented today. Also, please note this is a public chat, therefore avoid including confidential information with your question. If your question has not been answered, please submit it via our contact form, and you have the link visible on your screens. All materials from this webinar will be available afterwards, and you have the link visible on your screens now. With that, I would like to thank you all for joining and for your attention and wish you all a good day.